Buonasera.
Good afternoon. Money and power. This is a line that has been quoted many times by Don Giussani. The seeking heart of man can actually see to the temptation of an apparent satisfaction. It's a shortcut. It's a try to satisfy the need for fullness. Abbot Lepre yesterday said that the road is not a shortcut. The real road, the real path is another one. Why should we take that path? The answer is the whole meaning of the meeting. But there are some false alternatives that are really attractive. And money is probably the most attractive of all, because everything around us and in ourselves tells us this is your answer, this is your solution, this is how you can satisfy the needs of those who suffer, the needs of those who look for great things. That's how you can reach solidity, well-being, welfare. So there's actually a relationship between money and good, between money and doing good for others. So there's this need to understand more from a different perspective, to understand more the nature of our heart, of its temptation, its expectation, the need to question the most attractive of all images. And this is how today's meeting was born. Cardinal George Pell is here with us today, and it is quite difficult for me to introduce him because his biography is so long. I can only say that the first time I went and met him, we talked about the meeting in Rimini, and he asked, can I come, but without intervening as a speaker. So he came last year under disguise, so to speak, and he won the award of the best visitor because he actually saw so many things and remembered them all. Once I asked him, well, maybe it sounds strange, but I would like to propose a different evening to spend together. Let's watch a movie together. And the title was The Good Road, translated from Italian. And he appreciated the flesh of the two Australian friends that come out from the sea, Sun, Surf and Community School. He was the Archbishop of Melbourne in 1996, and in Sydney in 2001, became a Cardinal in 2003. He was the President of Caritas Australia, founder of the Australian Catholic University. He worked in so many different sectors. In Rome, he founded Domus Australia, and I can say that he's proud of it. He authorizes me to say that he's proud of it. It is a residential center for pilgrims that actually welcomes also people. He says also people that are not Australians, but, well, they have to pay. In 2013, Pope Francis included him in the group of 8 cardinals that then became the C9 that advises the Pope in the management of the Church. In February 2014, he has been nominated Prefect of the Secretary for Economy, that is responsible for the preparation of the budget of the Holy Seat, the control and surveys of the Vatican. So, well, he has a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. I would like to welcome you here and to thank you really from the bottom of my heart to spend some time with us. I know that you would have preferred to just visit the meeting in Rimini and maybe win again the Best Visitor Award, but we really wanted to hear your voice about this very important topic, money and the church.
Thank you, Robert, for those kind words of introduction. It came as a surprise to me many decades into my priesthood to read the claim that our Lord Jesus Christ had condemned riches, warned the rich about the dangers of being rich more frequently than he condemned hypocrisy. I can claim, of course, that I knew that of Jesus' teaching on poverty and riches. However, the Irish-Australian community I belong to was strongly committed to the idea of social mobility and social justice. In Australia, we are a migrant society, and all migrants migrate for the sake of their children and grandchildren. Coming from such a tradition, and as a priest who was not rich, I reacted uneasily to the rough moral equivalence of riches and hypocrisy in Jesus' teaching. Christianity is a revealed religion, not a scientific, economic, or even philosophical theory, which came to us from God through the Spirit-filled teachings of Jesus and the apostles. It has a unique authority because of its divine origins and is not merely the fruit of human devising. We have the magisterium to ensure that what we teach today is the same as the teachings of Jesus. Today, the Catholic Church, with her magnificent cathedrals and churches, abbeys and convents, schools, universities and hospitals, appears to be very rich. Sometimes these communities are rich, rather than being asset-rich and cash-poor, regularly short of funds for daily operations. Is the Church still faithful to Jesus' teachings on poverty and riches? Has the Church changed her teaching over the centuries? A few basic logical distinctions will help us grapple with these questions. The Greek philosopher Aristotle distinguished between substantial changes, such as the death of a person, and accidental changes of quantity, quality, or capacity, which leaves the entity's essential nature as it was. The mustard seed grows into a large bush, and the butterfly develops from the caterpillar. God does not change, just as mathematical things do not change, even when our understandings of these principles have to be modified in the light of new knowledge. On the other hand, we should begin by acknowledging that while central Catholic religious teachings do not change substantially, even when we have accidental changes, like water changing into ice or steam. Famously, Cardinal John Henry Newman spoke of the development of doctrine. As we come to understand more clearly and comprehensively the nature of the unchanged substance of the doctrine and spell out the consequences of these understandings. The teachings of the first ecumenical councils in the 4th and 5th centuries, as they spell out how Jesus was and is both divine and human, is the most famous example of this process of theologizing. In the light of these distinctions, we can return to our theme on God and mammon, on the church and money, and rephrase our questions. Do the original New Testament teachings on riches and poverty retain their truth and importance? Has the Church's teaching on money changed? Was this a genuine development or a repudiation of the past? Did the role of money, at least in Western society, begin to change around the 11th century? The scriptural teachings. Jesus' teachings on money, poverty, and riches is original, provocative, and multifaceted, with its roots in the Old Testament, but going beyond even the teachings of the prophets. The teaching or the story of the rich young man is a good place to start. Jesus told him that if he wanted to be perfect, he should sell all his possessions and give the proceeds to the poor. And the young man was unable to take up this challenge as he was very rich. Jesus then went further and told his astonished disciples that it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. But it was possible for God to allow this or enable it, even if it was impossible without God's help. Jesus used hyperbole to great effect with images that compelled the attention of the hearer, forcing him to confront new and even unpleasant truths and work out what they might mean in his life and in society more generally. The eye of the needle is a spectacular example of this, provoking thought, discussion, and debate for 2,000 years. With the economic downturn in the Western world after 2007 and 8, with the losses of the last few days, less defensive action is necessary against the awful curse in Luke's chapter 6, which follows the Beatitudes. But alas for you who are rich, you are having your consolation now. We admit more easily that the Beatitudes are at the heart of Christian teaching, but we struggle with the woes or curses. Here Jesus is hammering home his foundational teaching that the values of the kingdom are not those of this world, not those of pagan common sense. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but in heaven where they cannot be destroyed by moth or woodworm. Jesus understood money and knew of its power to fascinate, corrupt, and capture the human heart. Everyone must choose, young or old, rich or poor, religious or irreligious, lay persons, priest or religious. No one can be the slave of two masters. You cannot be the slave both of God and money. The lure of riches can choke the word of God so that it produces nothing. Jesus warns against greed. Because life is not defined by our positions, this task rather is to become rich in the sight of God. Time and again in his parables, Jesus draws on unexpected figures and activities. He praises the unjust steward for his astuteness and urges his followers to use money, tainted as it is, to be generous to their friends, so that they will welcome their benefactors into heaven. If they cannot handle money, that tainted thing, honestly and correctly, who could trust them with genuine riches? While an openness of heart, a poverty of spirit is necessary for any person to accept the good news of Jesus Christ and his call to conversion, Jesus himself realized that not everyone was called to perfection, not everyone called to join his circle of immediate disciples and embrace poverty. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, probably prosperous enough, retained their possessions at least during Jesus' lifetime, as did Joseph of Arimathea, described as a rich man and disciple who provided Jesus' tomb. What was required of everyone, especially of the rich, was generosity, using their wealth to help others, to further the work of the kingdom, and not closing their heart to those who are suffering. The parable of Dives and Lazarus shows vividly what is required in this life and what will be rewarded or punished in the next life. The rich man was dressed in purple and fine linen and feasted magnificently every day. He completely ignored Lazarus, covered with sores, which were licked by dogs, who lived at the gateway to his residence and scrounged his food from the leftovers of the feasts. When both characters died, Lazarus was taken into the happiness of Abraham's embrace, while the formerly rich man was condemned to the torments of Hades and separated from those on the other side by a great gulf. The lessons are clear. Jesus worked with individuals who were prosperous, provided they were just and generous. He accepted the invitation of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, to dine with him. And it was Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 1980s and a pioneer of the free market economic reforms, who pointed out that without sufficient capital, without significant wealth, the Good Samaritan would not have been able to afford the care of the man who was beaten, robbed, and left on the roadside. Jesus obviously built on the Old Testament moral teaching about money and traditions. However, the Old Testament did not regard poverty as an ideal to be chosen. The promised land was to be flowing with all good things, milk and honey. God enriches the persons whom he loves, such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even Job returns to prosperity after his trials and sufferings. As in Homer's Greece, riches indicated personal nobility for the Jews. It was a novelty when Jesus compared the kingdom of heaven to the treasure hidden in a field, to find pearls, while urging his followers to sell everything they own in order to buy these treasures. The Old Testament had no teaching equivalent to the Beatitudes. How blessed are you who are poor, the kingdom of God is yours. Blessed are you who are hungry now, you shall have your fill. These were revolutionary concepts. We don't have time to examine all the other New Testament teachings on money, except to mention the fierce hostility to the rich found in the Epistle of St. James. The rich will be brought low, and they will wither like grass and the wild flower. Jesus takes up this theme again in chapter 5, even more vigorously. The wealth of the rich is rotting, their gold and silver corroding. But the wealthy who are condemned are unjust and corrupt. They do not pay just wages and even kill the upright. James does not wrestle explicitly with the situation and fate of the rich people who are good and just, but I doubt that he would ever have become a supporter of the market economy. During church history, there have been different times. For the first 3 centuries, there was no religious freedom and therefore no churches as public buildings. With Constantine, this changed. First of all, religious freedom, and then the sponsorship of church and church activities. The church eventually became quite rich. With the disintegration of the West and the arrival of the barbarians, in many places the bishops became de facto leaders and rulers of the regions. I experienced something of this in Rabaul in Papua New Guinea in '94, when an immense eruption covered Rabaul with volcanic ash. For a week or 10 days, there was no government activity, and it was the Catholic Archbishop, a great German missionary, who was the only effective public authority with the will and the means to help the local communities by providing food, medicine, and shelter. Big changes came with the Benedictine monasteries. Then we had the discovery of the New World, the Protestant Reformation, the rise of capitalism. However, I want to examine only one example, and that is the legitimation of the idea of interest. Today we define usury as the charging of an exorbitant rate of interest on a loan. This is regarded as morally unacceptable and is mentioned briefly and condemned in the Catechism of the Catholic Church and at slightly more length in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. However, any interest payment was forbidden in the Christian churches and more widely until the 19th century. While it is sometimes alleged there was an absolute prohibition on charging interest, this is an overstatement, at least in Old Testament times. Ezekiel certainly denounced taking interest as an appalling crime, to be ranked with adultery and idol worship, especially when the poor and weak are grossly exploited. And similarly, the Jews could charge interest on loans to non-Jews, such as Egyptians and Babylonians. The generous loaning of money without interest was praised as highly as the oppression of the poor was condemned. The ancient philosophers, Greek and Roman, believed that generally that money was sterile, serving only as a medium of exchange. And Aristotle in particular was the most important philosophical influence on Christian thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas. He argued that money did not reproduce itself, did not produce its own kind, unlike both a monkey and a monkey tree. We have no money tree. Money is not fertile, and it was contrary to nature for the banker to make money from a loan. Charging interest on a loan was charging for nothing. Patterns of trade based on exchange mechanisms and gold and silver coins continued basically unchanged from the pre-Christian times until the Middle Ages. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Western Europe was not as economically advanced as the Eastern Christian Empire of Byzantium and the realms of Islam. However, about the time of the medieval warming, the spread of the Cluniac reforms of the Benedictines across Europe, the revitalization of the papacy, and the expansion of the Normans into the Holy Land, England, through Italy and into Sicily, at that time growth in trade led to a shortage of gold and silver. It was difficult and dangerous to transport precious metals across hundreds and thousands of kilometers, and money changers who could ensure that coins were not debased with less valuable substitutes also began to keep deposits for clients where they credited one account and subtracted from the other for trade exchanges. Arithmetic expressed in banknotes began to replace actual coins, and this required trust between disparate people, and banking was born. The surplus money, the capital of a small elite, was no longer hoarded and unproductive, but available for others to use. Many Benedictine monasteries across the decades and indeed centuries were examples of this incipient capitalism at work. Towns and even universities developed around and from the monasteries. To use this money, the bankers applied a fee for service, which they did not describe as interest or usury. In these changed conditions, thinkers began to realize that money could be fertile and had a time value. If X loans 1,000 euros for a year, he loses the opportunity to use this money himself, and it is appropriate to impose an opportunity cost on the borrower. Whenever money is lent, we always have the risk that the loan will not be repaid fully and on time, and the lender always acts with some risk attached to the transition and chooses a price to offset that risk. The intellectual life of the medieval society in the West was dominated by the clergy, just as dioceses and monasteries and guilds were powerful economic forces. The birth of a rudimentary form of economics from Christian moral thinking was not inevitable. But it's not surprising that such developments, intellectual breakthroughs, were made by the clergy. We shouldn't forget that these stirrings began and continued against a backdrop of official church teaching hostile to usury. Charging interest on loans was forbidden to the clergy as early as the Council of Nicaea in 325. 800 years later, the practice was itself formally condemned at the Third Lateran Council in 1179, although the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 allowed the practice to Jews. Official disapproval was voiced by Pope Benedict XIV in 1745 and continued into the 19th century. In the beginning of this proto-capitalism, the rise and spread of banking and some movement to what we now see as a market economy, in all this, two developments can be described as noteworthy and even unexpected. To my big surprise, many of the first economic theorists were Franciscans, followers of St. Francis of Assisi, the Poverello, the saint most noted for his radical practice of personal poverty. And secondly, every bank in Western Europe for 200 or 300 years, until well to the 15th century, was in Italy or was a branch of an Italian bank. There was a complete Italian monopoly of banking. In 1231, we find 69 Italian banking branches in England. The Franciscan Peter Olivi, who died in 1298, wrote in De Contractibus Usurariis, "Property or money put to work for gain also has, and I quote, a certain seminal quality of generating profit, which we commonly call capital. And therefore not only does the simple value of the object have to be returned, but also an added value." A century or so later, the well-known Saint Bernardine of Siena, a remarkable preacher and miracle worker, wrote that it was legitimate for creditors to charge interests on loans, slightly adapting the passage of Olivi just quoted to make up for the lucrem cessans, the profits given up or opportunity cost. Sermon 34. Both writers vigorously opposed usury. From the 14th century, the Franciscans put into practice what they were preaching by forming loan companies, which gave the poor small loans. They were known as Montes Pietatis, and originally were funded by donations from wealthy Christians. When they went one step further and themselves began to charge interest, often between 4 and 12%, the controversy deepened. They were defended by Blessed Bernardine of Feltre, who died in 1494, who explained that charging interest was essential to making the scheme self-sustaining, and Pope Paul II approved the original Mons in Perugia in 1472. Eventually, there were hundreds of such Montes credit unions around Europe. The Monte dei Paschi di Siena was founded in 1472 and continues today as one of Italy's largest banks. All this was an important initial contribution to developing the means of creating modern prosperity. Jesus' own teaching has one interesting reference to earning interest. He was particularly provocative, and his parables often featured unpopular figures such as tax collectors, the unjust steward, the cynical judge, Samaritans. These caught the attention of listeners and provoked them to reflection. In Jesus' parable of the talents, the master rebuked the servant who had received 1 talent as lazy and wicked, because he had buried the money and done nothing with it. It had not been wasted or thrown away, simply conserved. The master remonstrated that you should have deposited my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have recovered my capital with interest. So now take the talent from him and give it to the man who has the 10 talents. Given Jesus' regular use of unusual examples in his parables, we cannot conclude that Jesus approved of charging interest, but he was clearly aware of the practice. The exploitation of the poor is regularly condemned, but the New Testament does not give a developed teaching on charging interest or usury. What does the teaching of Jesus say to us as individuals and communities today? Christ's distinctive teaching on the importance of poverty and poverty of spirit has always had profound consequences among his disciples, and especially among those who aspire to follow Jesus closely and shape their lives according to his teachings. In religious orders, a commitment to personal poverty by their members is one of the three traditional vows, together with obedience and chastity. A poverty of spirit is appreciated inside and outside the Catholic Church, and the serious commitment of Pope Francis across the decades of his life as a Jesuit and a bishop to a simple lifestyle is one of the reasons for his influence and popularity. Christians are not Manichaeans. We do not believe that either matter or the flesh are evils. They are part of God's creation. While Jesus regularly insisted on the primacy of things spiritual and on the importance of the life after death, neither possessions nor money-making are forbidden. Riches are an ambiguous blessing, dangerous and seductive. Money is tainted, and many are encouraged to be greedy by financial success. Greed can start to come upon us slowly and silently, and regular generosity is the best response to this temptation, this onset of blindness and insensitivity. This is why every person and every community must choose either God or money, the poor as well as the rich. Envy was forbidden in the Mosaic commandments, and lying, thieving, and any illegal activity are not to be permitted because they might be profitable. Family life and religious life are two examples which embody higher values, and neither should be ignored or damaged by the pursuit of wealth. The New Testament gives no blessing to any type of prosperity gospel, where people are encouraged to follow Christ with the promise that they will become rich or at least less poor. For Christians, prosperity is no certain sign of God's blessing, although honest, hard-working, and common-sense people who are serious Christians can easily be found among the more prosperous. And business activities which contribute to genuine human flourishing are to be encouraged and commended. The poverty Jesus endorsed is sometimes mentioned as poverty of spirit. This is a useful pointer because the Lord is not condemning misery, cruelty, or exploitation. Christians are, for example, strongly opposed to slavery and human trafficking. The poverty recommended is basically simplicity of life, where the rudimentary comforts would be defined differently in different ages, and the level and nature of the penances vary according to the different Christian spiritualities. Those practicing poverty can be very rich spiritually, rich in insight, wise in counsel, and effective guides towards God and Christ in prayer. But on the other hand, poor and prayerful Christians can also lack insight, be the holy fools which Saint Teresa of Avila urged us to avoid. Intellectual poverty poses a different challenge. If we want to follow Christ closely, does this mean that we are discouraged from higher education? That it is somehow better to be faithful, prayerful, and ignorant of intellectual and even theological truths than to be faithful, prayerful, and highly educated. Education is a form of riches. It's good, but a form of riches, which can take us away from the ideal of a simple child and can make it harder to believe. But education is necessary, for example, in a priest. So too it is dangerous for persons to be highly educated in secular disciplines, but have the level of religious understanding typical of a primary school child. Educated people preserve and develop their faith by striving towards a second naivety, a holy simplicity which recognizes a hierarchy of values as defined by the Lord. The high point of wisdom is to be simple and prudent. This is from John Chrysostom, and Pope John the 23rd had it at the introduction to his Journal of a Soul. For Jews and Christians, education is a blessing, but it still brings its own temptations. Christ's teachings on poverty and riches is also important for all Christian communities, including parishes, dioceses, and religious orders. As a minimum, they should all be careful, aware that problems will occur again as they have since New Testament times. John's Gospel tells us that Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, was a thief. And in the Acts chapter 5, we read of Ananias and Sapphira, who concealed part of the revenue due to the community and suffered the consequences. By an unhappy coincidence, in one of my early parishes, a couple of the altar servers were discovered to be stealing small amounts regularly from the weekly collections. And over my years in parishes, I took precautions that no one person was regularly alone and out of sight with the collection. Sometimes the total of the weekly collection varied according to the presence or absence of one of the counters, but this might have been a coincidence. On a more positive note, the Christian communities from the beginning followed and developed the Jewish tradition of caring for the poor, especially for widows and travelers. As Paul's teachings were approved by Peter, James, and John, he boasted that their only stipulation was that he remember the poor in Jerusalem, an activity he was performing already. The tradition of donating to help the poor, sick, and suffering has continued unbroken for the whole of Christian history and has probably kept pace with the enormous increase of wealth in our societies. One example are the Caritas organizations around the world, which continue to do marvelous works of relief, especially in times of disasters and development, encouraging recipients, often overseas, to make their own decisions and use the donations productively, so working to avoid developing a climate of dependency. Once again, however, Christianity has a distinctive approach different from that of non-believing humanitarians. Jesus teaches that the first commandment is to love the one true God, the unseen transcendent, while the second, which requires us to love our neighbor in deeds as well as words, is like the first. It follows from this that any human activity, for example, work for social justice, cannot replace the need for prayer and worship. Catholic justice and charitable works are always Christocentric. From a Christian perspective, good works are insufficient when God is eliminated, and genuine faith is always a stimulus to good works. Economic life today is more complicated than it has ever been. And that's why canon law, the church law, requires the presence of at least 3 Christi Fideles, lay economic experts on every diocesan finance council. However, it is dangerous, morally wrong, when a church leader, bishop, a parish priest or religious superior is content to take no interest in how the church money is used and to claim blithely that he doesn't understand money. This leaves the field open to incompetence and rogues. A church leader doesn't need to be expert, but he must be able to see a hole in a ladder and give a realistic personal judgment that such church money under his control is being well used. When we acknowledge the universal nature of original sin, of the obdurate persistence of human limitations, we can understand better that it is prudent for dioceses and religious orders to own their own churches, monasteries, and schools. This provides for security across the generations. Only a limited number of moral heroes can live in radical poverty, and even the best religious groupings will contain a moral mix. It is important that the institution is distinguished from the individual, so that, for example, a parish priest does not treat the parish possessions as his own. Nor does the church patronage belong only to one generation. Apart from crisis times, such as wars or famines, inherited wealth should be used to finance all the church's good works and should not be expended on any one generation. My ambition as Archbishop was to use church money vigorously for church purposes, but to pass on to my successor what I had received. But this is not an iron rule, because a bishop could conclude that his diocese is over-endowed, over-rich with money or property, and that these assets should be realized and the funds used in other ways. But the maintenance of the patrimony is a good basic principle. Fortunately, I've never been in a situation where my diocese was overburdened with historic buildings, unsuited to today's pastoral needs, or requiring a number of personnel which was no longer available or affordable. I am sure it's sad to have to allow church property to be sold, to pass into other hands, but the pastoral needs of the people must always come first. In the Vatican, we are attempting to put into practice Christian teachings on poverty, wealth, service of the suffering and poor. Modern accounting methods are good and probably the best way of ensuring honesty and efficiency. This requires high-level lay expertise and the adoption of the principle of transparency, where we report to the wider community, including the Catholic laity, what church authorities are doing with church money. It is good for those who have access to church patrimony to be accountable in this world and not only to God. When the church has investments and properties, church authorities have a moral obligation to obtain appropriate levels of financial return. When this is not achieved, it often means someone else makes the gains. In one of my dioceses, a parish priest rented out a large building for a low and insufficient rent. his tenant subleased part of the property for a greater sum than that which he was paying the priest for the whole building. Leasing properties which are given to us to administer on trust to friends or friends of friends at low rates below market values is wrong, morally wrong. Now is the time to have our affairs in order, or to place our affairs in order, to have them arranged in such a way that this can be demonstrated to the outside world. The next wave of attacks on the Church could be for financial irregularities. What we are attempting in the Vatican has lessons for the wider Church. A European princess once told me that some looked on the Vatican as being like an old noble family that was going bankrupt, losing all its money. They expected it to be incompetent, extravagant, and easy pickings for thieves. We are all working hard in the Holy See under the leadership of Pope Francis to change this image.
Grazie, Eminenza.
Well, I'd like to really thank Cardinal George Pell, because in his overview of the history of Christianity, he showed us that man becomes aware of the possessions of his goods through an effort of understanding and of thinking. Not everything is given from the very beginning, so it is a responsibility of man to make this effort and to use money in the proper way. So I do believe this is one of the points that underlies the whole of your intervention. So the theme of the fact that man has to think, to reflect on everything that God has put as at man's disposal. Yes, we certainly need to treat money in the right way. And I understand that this is a great effort in this moment. In the conclave before the election of Pope Francis, the majority of cardinals said that we need to organize things in a better way. We need to clean our house. We need to be more transparent and more efficient. So that's what we're working at. That's our goal. This reform would be impossible without the support of the Pope. So I would like to publicly thank him for his support, to our work.
Noi abbiamo fatto
We made substantial progress. We have in our Council for Economy experts, cardinals, laymen from all over the world. We have some accountants who are, and we have someone who actually controls all our systems. He has access to everything we do to make sure there is no corruption. We have an agency against money laundering. And so all these are important progresses we have made. There is still a lot to do. We prepared for the first time in history balance sheet of all the properties of the Vatican, and it is very accurate. And we found out that there was 1,300,000,000 that could not be seen in the previous balance sheets, and that's interesting.
C'è molto da fare, c'è un disadvantage, c'è un deficit.
So there's a deficit. There's a deficit over the last 2 days, and this will probably go on. We need to work. We have an adequate pension fund for the next 10 to 15 years, but we need to do really something because we want to make sure that in 20, 25 years we will still have enough funds. It would be impossible to go back to the old system, and we need to carry on these reforms. It's been an honor for me to participate at this process. But this is not the most difficult thing. I said many, many times that it is easier to organize the Vatican's finances than to provoke or cause a conversion. So with your applause, we would like to thank once again Cardinal George Pell, who's been with us this afternoon for this Lectio Magistralis. And this is one of the ways for us to really experience firsthand that the Church is really our leader in life, because it teaches and it learns at the same time. So we wish Cardinal Pell every success in his work, and I wish you all a pleasant evening. And I'd like to remind you that the meeting proposes a support to the organization of this big event that is based on the culture of friendship. So this is a way to use money in a good way. So if you donate, you become a member of the community meeting. You can donate in different places on the fairgrounds or on the website of the meeting. Have a pleasant evening. Bye-bye.